Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Artemis, for that introduction, and thank you very much to the Sylvia Ioannou Foundation for organising this event and for inviting me to participate in it. I'm very honoured to be invited to give the keynote lecture, so thank you very much. The title is there on the screen, and I'll endeavour to elaborate on that as I go through this short lecture. I'll start with a quote. L.P. Hartley, who famously stated that the past is a foreign country. They do things very differently there. If we could travel back in time to the 1970s, it would seem as if we were visiting a very foreign country. Though it was scarcely 4 decades ago, things were very different then. In Northwest Europe and parts of North America, there were industrial heartlands with factories and coal mines and armies of manual labourers. China, India and Brazil were largely agrarian countries with huge peasant populations. A Cold War between the NATO countries and the Soviet bloc cast a dark shadow over geopolitical relations, while physical combat in Vietnam, the Middle East and Africa had global ramifications. Yugoslavia had yet to become the former Yugoslavia. Things were very different in the maritime sector in the 1970s. The traditional maritime nations dominated sea transport. Chiefly European, these nations had significant interests in shipping, shipbuilding and ports. Seemingly vital interests, especially in places like Britain, with organisational structures, business strategies and operational practices firmly rooted in the 19th century. It's not too far removed from the truth to say that the 19th century in Britain did not finish until about 1975. And there's an image from Wallsend Shipyard in Tyneside in England in 1973, showing a vessel under construction overshadowing the terraced houses where the shipyard workers largely lived. The traditional maritime nations, again with Britain at the fore, extracted fish in vast, unsustainable quantities from the waters of the North Atlantic during the 19th centuries. They extracted fish from waters distant from home, but up to 12 or 50 miles from the shores of small, apparently weak coastal states such as Iceland, Norway, the Faroes, etc. And there's a vessel from Hull which was lost in 1974 with all hands off the coast of northern Norway, allegedly engaged in spying activity. 21st century visitors to the 1970s would be surprised at the state of historical research in that remote and very foreign era. They would find some familiar things back in the 1970s, such as graduate students extracting seemingly obscure data from great runs of dirty documentary material housed in dingy archive offices. But our time travellers, people from now going back to the 70s, would be astonished to see that these graduate students in the 1970s were equipped with just a pencil, a notepad, and a pack of 5 by 3 inch record cards. They would also be surprised there was a very small number of these graduate students occupied in historical research compared to today. And amongst the number of, that limited number of data miners, we might call them, miners of data, they would find one particularly wretched individual labouring day after day in the Public Record Office in Chancery Lane, London. There it is, on a set of papers generated by the High Court of Admiralty, which Charles Dickens, no less, described as a cosy, dozy, old-fashioned, time-forgotten, sleepy-headed little family party. I can assure you that I was that wretched individual. And in the 1970s, I even had hair. For reasons that I still don't fully understand, in 1977, not long after the world's shipping and shipbuilding industries had crashed in the wake of the global oil crises, and not longer after distant water trawling had collapsed due to the imposition of the 200-mile exclusive economic zones, I arrived at the University of Exeter in southwest England to study for an MA in the history of the Atlantic economy. There, I was told, I didn't choose, I was told that's what it was like in the 1970s, that I would be researching and writing an MA dissertation on privateering in the port of Liverpool during the wars of the 18th century. And now, nearly 40 years on, I find myself in another very different foreign country, addressing an audience of scholars who I'm sure know a lot more about prize-taking at sea in this part of the world than I do. An audience of scholars, moreover, I'm sure have a lot more equipment at their disposal than a pencil, a notepad, and a set of 5 by 3-inch record cards to assemble their evidence. For of course now, historical researchers have laptops, spreadsheets, relational databases, cameras and archival material that is not only online but is searchable by keyword. I really hate you all. And here's a screenshot from the National Archives in London, as it's called. Note, the National Archives, not the British National Archives. We're very arrogant in Britain. And this is a list, an online index of one of the sets of the High Court of Admiralty archive, which I laboured upon years and years ago. It's all searchable, it's all online, there's a vast array of material available at your keypads. So what can I advise you at the start of this conference on Corsairs and Pirates in the Eastern Mediterranean during the early modern era? Firstly, I can assure you that I've done quite a bit more than simple data mining since the happy days of the 1970s. The focus of my research on prize-taking at sea has remained on British privateering in the 18th century, but I've dabbled a little bit more in the history of piracy, and I've listened to and I've learned from historians of prize-taking in the Caribbean, West Africa, East Africa, South America and Southeast Asia, as well as the Baltic and maritime zones, which again the British rather arrogantly call home waters. And I've learned a great deal about the complex, difficult and fascinating role of commerce raiding in the Mediterranean, more in the western reaches of that inland sea than in the eastern reaches, but nevertheless I've learnt a lot from colleagues working in that area. More importantly, perhaps, I can confirm that whatever the resources at the disposal of researchers, the key concepts that underpin the discipline of history remain very much the same as they were in the 1970s and beyond. I will now share with you some thoughts about how commerce raiding at sea, in the Eastern Mediterranean and in other seas, sits within the broad, and I would say a vibrant discipline of history. I will endeavour to relate our subject area, maritime commerce raiding, to 5 basic propositions relating to historical inquiry. And these propositions can quite comfortably be converted into questions for our speakers at our conference over the next couple of days. First proposition on the screen there. History does not exist for us to discover. It is something we choose to make and is therefore subjective, contested, significant, and in Eric Hobsbawm's words, potentially dangerous. Why do we choose to study the activities of a relatively small proportion of the population? That's what pirates and privateers and commerce raiders and corsairs are. A small proportion of the population in any given setting who decided to engage in violent, high-risk, often criminal prize-taking activity. Is it because we are fascinated with behaviours in which we ourselves would never engage? Is it a form of escapism or voyeurism? Is it because the so-called general public appear to be fascinated by such subjects that we apply our professional expertise to them? Are we anxious to set the record straight to unveil the reality that contrasts or conforms the myth? Or do we want to use the commerce raiding past to reveal uncomfortable, troublesome, dangerous truths about the inequalities, injustices and constraints of our current political and economic social systems? There are many possible answers to such questions, and perhaps we'll hear some of them during the next 2 days. Whatever the answers, history remains contested and potentially dangerous. And here's a simple example. The Western Mediterranean, and they're circled, is just a mention of the USS Philadelphia, the Americans operating in the Western Mediterranean in the early 19th century, where they burned Tripoli, bombarded Tripoli in the summer of 1804, etc., etc., a familiar story. So what are we really talking about here? North African corsairs, legitimate privateers, as Northwest Europeans would call them, or Barbary pirates? It's a contested past. It's a very relevant past as well. Ron Paul, a US Senator for Texas, in 2001, implored the President of the United States to go back into the past and to permit the issue of letters of marque and reprisal, to commission privately armed and equipped persons to seize outside of the United States the person and property of Osama bin Laden or any Al-Qaeda co-conspirator who are responsible for the terrorist attacks on the United States on September the 11th, 2001. A right-wing Republican, Ron Paul, looked into the past and said one way to gain reprisal on Osama bin Laden was to issue letters of marque and reprisal, as the Americans and certainly the English might have done in the 18th century and earlier. Secondly, and leading directly on from that point, history is relevant to contemporary life. Knowing and understanding the past is critical in explaining the present, and helping us cope with the future. There's ample evidence from our particular subject area to support this contention. For instance, the surge in piracy off East Africa, off Somalia, over the last decade has led journalists and policy makers to look at the past for insight onto how to suppress such activity. We've seen now, just the slide before last, there have been calls from the American government to resort to the issue of letters of marque, an ancient practice, to correct wrongs in the present. And of course, we should not forget the burgeoning interest of children and members of the general public, we might say, in pirate stories. This is a clear demonstration of the relevance of piracy, especially to the present day. It's in the popular imagination, but it's a vital factor of our subject area. And there's an image from British TV of a children's pirate there with his parrot and his telescope. And to sharpen this up, what's he looking at through that telescope? Well, he's looking perhaps at contemporary pirates that we've heard about in East Africa. They're attacking a container ship in the waters off Somalia. So, history of our subject area is extremely relevant. Thirdly, history is interdisciplinary. It's primarily humanist. It deals with people, with human populations, with the human experience over time and space. But it is shaped by biology, the attributes, the simple attributes of being human. Birth, death, gender, race, taste, desire, emotions, beliefs have greatly influenced how humans have acted. Psychology, behaviours, decision-making, group dynamics, individualism, collectivism. These are factors in why people consciously decided to wage war against other people. Social and political science, the evolution of states, institutions and social forces. These explain the frameworks, the legal and social frameworks in which commerce raiding took place. And of course the environment in which this activity took place. The marine environment, we saw some slides earlier of the islands and the waters of the Eastern Mediterranean. These shape naturally the activity of human actors. We can express this in English in a number of words beginning with the letter R. Retaliation is a good one. Responding to acts of violence, perhaps, committed against oneself. The English are very good at retaliation. The man who led this tradition of retaliation was probably Francis Drake, Sir Francis Drake, who engaged in a number of perfectly legitimate and peaceful trading operations in the Caribbean and off Spanish America in the late 16th century, as you perhaps know. And one of his great tactics was to get his retaliation in first. Spaniards hoving into view, threatening him, attack them first. We see this happening in various contexts since then. It's still relevant. We get our retaliation in first. That's a particular favourite of mine because you'll see there at the back. I can get the cursor there. I was engaged in that match. In my own mind. Revenge. Here we move into the gender side of things. Revenge, as you very well know, is a dish best served cold. by Uma Thurman. Females in piracy, females in privateering. It's a popular subject. Is it a myth? Is it a reality? Retribution and recompense are two further good English words which are moving in the same direction. Slightly different meanings, and this takes me to Ron Paul and reprisal. Reprisal, an important aspect of our subject, certainly in an English context. My fourth proposition or question is that history entails knowledge and understanding of the past. That's fairly straightforward. That's what history is about. But these two components really should be distinguished. Knowledge generated through historical techniques applied to primary sources with a pencil, with a notepad, with those record cards. It's fairly straightforward. But what's important to historians is understanding, and that requires an appreciation of context, empathy, and significance. Understanding is the stock in trade of the professional historian. I'll offer an example, and this is where the title of my talk comes into play. Adopting a broad, long-term approach, thereby in some ways paying homage on the shores of his sea to Ferdinand Braudel. It is my understanding that commerce raiding activity in the British Atlantic world assumed one of three main forms over the long term. Firstly, it was a parasitic form of activity, or aspects of it were parasitic. Natural parasites feed and shelter on or in a different organism while contributing nothing to the survival of their host. Some seafarers worked outside the law as pirates, and they grew within and lived off and contributed nothing towards merchant shipping. Other seafarers, sometimes cast as buccaneers, emerged beyond the law to grow within and live off the Spanish-American Empire in the Caribbean and South America. And such parasites adopted various business models, although most owned their own vessels and shared their gains between themselves. Another form of British prize-taking activity relates more to privateering, and this really involves predatory activity. Natural predators prey on other species. Our predators, our privateers, prey on other species or other nationalities of seafarers. Their ventures were undertaken in ships of reprisal, private ships of war and letters of marque, all of which functioned within the law, in contrast to pirates, their owners and crew being remunerated to a large, if varying extent, by shares in the proceeds of the seizure of other peoples, other species, seaborne property. And the third form of activity I've described as opportunistic. This relates to merchants and naval seafarers who seized opportunities to take prizes. This constituted the bulk of the seafaring workforce during the early modern period, for merchant seafarers and naval seamen all had the capability, they all had the right, in particular circumstances, to seize prizes belonging to other people. And we know exactly how many of these potential prize takers there were, because one wretched individual has sat there with his pencil and worked it all out. And these are the figures I've come up with. There is quite a range over the course of the 18th century, as you can see there, from a low of 46,000 to a high of 276,000 in 1812, and spikes There are peaks during wartime. There's two things that all of these guys had in common. They could all benefit from the seizure of prizes. And the other thing in common, as the popular literature tells us, is that they all, to a man, had scurvy. This is the popular literature. This is what scurvy's like. So please, every one of you, eat your limes, eat your oranges, and eat your lemons, so that you don't end up like that. Now, over the long term, there were drivers of prize-taking activity. There were three of them in my view. The first of them, reprisal. Reprisal was a prominent feature as an activity in its own right down to the early 17th century in the English situation. And it remained as a notion, as a justification for activity much later on, right through into the 18th and 19th century. This word reprisal is there. The English, the British, were wronged and therefore were right in exacting reprisals on other nations. It's an important element, but it's often missing from the historical literature. The second broad driver of activity over the long term is business, is enterprise. This was a defining characteristic in the British experience and elsewhere through the 17th and 18th centuries. The British never resorted to guerre de course, to a form of private warfare, whereas the French and the Spaniards from time to time did. And the third aspect of this, the third driver as I've called it, is neutrality. Neutrality. The benefits and the practice of neutrality by other states shaped prize-taking enterprise, especially from the 1750s onwards. There were two key turning points in this historical process. Kenneth Andrews, who was a professor of history at the University of Hull before my time, wrote in one of his celebrated seminal works about this transition. Reprisal became privateering in the late 16th century. Proof of losses, which underpinned the medieval practice of reprisal, became little more than a legal fiction in the 1580s. Reprisal ventures were promoted by men who had never dreamed of trading in Spain, had never been anywhere near Spain, and never been wronged by the Spaniards. And in the summer of 1585, a host of voluntaries took to sea. Some of them were genuine ships of reprisal, some private men of war, equipped by gentlemen, and some were mere pirates. So in the late 16th century, it's enterprise that begins to take over from reprisal. In the 1780s, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War saw the second of these tipping points. And during this conflict, there is a shift towards neutrality. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was a very exciting period for British shipping entrepreneurs. Never was the spirit of privateering at such a pitch as at present. Every vessel that can swim upon the water was expediting for a cruise against the Dutch. The Dutch were particularly hated at this period because the Dutch were carrying French cargoes for a profit, and the British could not take those cargoes because they were defended not by guns but by neutral flags and neutral papers. So war against the Dutch gave the British the opportunity to take their vessels legitimately. And these are quotes from newspapers. Almost every vessel that lay for sale or lay idle in the Thames was bought up yesterday to act as a privateer against the Dutch. The present moment is a fine harvest for privateers. And the Dutch, from their imaginary security, must fall an easy conquest to our ships of war. This is what people felt. There was a privateering mania in late 1780, early 1781, but it didn't quite work out that way. And that's because the prospects facing predators were diminishing in this war, despite the increase in privateering activity. Neutrality was increasingly difficult to counter. And nearly every case involving the capture of a Dutch ship involved appeals, involved dispute, involved contest between captors and between neutral owners of the properties at stake. So British investors, despite rushing to fit out privateers, were disappointed in the return. And therefore, from 1780-81, certainly in the 1790s, they turned to trade and to opportunistic forms of prize-taking during the Napoleonic Wars and into the 1820s and beyond. That's certainly the case in the Latin American Wars of Independence of the 1810s, 1820s, when the British engaged as neutrals in those wars. And it'd be interesting to hear whether that was the case in the Eastern Mediterranean at the same period. And the last point, the last of the five propositions, is that history is dynamic and revolves around questions. But rather than striving to find all of the answers, historians should seek to ask better questions. That's the knack of history. It's not coming up with the answers, it's actually devising and addressing better questions. And in identifying and addressing better questions, we'll achieve the aim of this conference. So that's what I'm looking for over the next couple of days. Speakers. To illuminate and explain the history of piracy and corsairing in the Eastern Mediterranean during the early modern period. Let's ask some good questions and come up with some good answers. Thank you very much.